Building a sense of place through a sense of taste. In environmental education, outdoor ed, wherever you want to call it, we always talk about building a sense of place and the importance of it in our teaching. And we like to rely a lot on all of our senses, but I feel like oftentimes there's one sense that gets left behind, and that's the sense of taste. And for good reasons. It can be kind of intimidating to taste things around you, and could be very dangerous as well if you don't know what you're doing. So tonight I hope to share some easy ways to kind of dive into that a little bit. And I also, at certain points, I'm going to ask for your participation. So at those times, go ahead and unmute yourselves and we'll just chime in as well. So this will be somewhat interactive as well. So I don't like talking a lot. All right. So terroir. What is terroir? One definition is the combination of factors including soil, climate, and sunlight that gives wine grapes their distinctive character. You often hear this term in relation to wine or wine grapes, but it really just applies to everything, because what it boils down to is all the factors that go into and affect a plant growing or an animal living even. So terroir is really place when you boil it down. So that includes your geology, what kind of soils you have. It includes your elevation, what kind of water you have. Do you get a lot of rain? Are you near standing water? Are you in an arid area? Temperature, sunlight, all of those things factor in. So for some examples of how this would affect tasting your environment, in a very simple way, certain areas are going to have plants that other areas just don't have. For instance, here in central Vermont, we don't have any black birch, or if we do, they're extremely rare. But if you go just 2 hours south, go down to the Brattleboro area, and they start popping up all over the place. And distilling it even further down, you can have ostrich fern in a floodplain. I know right at the North Branch Nature Center, we have it all around the borders of the river. But if you go just a few yards away and a little bit higher, just a few feet higher in elevation, there won't be any because the conditions aren't quite right. So, why teach with wild edible plants? Well, there's a lot of reasons why. I phrased that question the way I did because I do see wild edibles as a way to teach, not just about the plants themselves, but about other factors in the landscape. For instance, food can be considered, can show cultural and landscape history. And this is a quote that I'm going to read. I just found really interesting in some research that I've done. This is from the History of Montpelier, which is a subsection from the volume 4 of the Vermont Gazetteer, which was published in 1882, written by A.M. Hemingway. The food of the sturdy foresters. Oh, I'll pause a second. So this excerpt was taken from a detailed history of the founding of Montpelier. And going into it, the foresters that she's talking about are the first people that moved in and settled Montpelier in the late 1700s. And most of them were foresters because they were working on clearing the land to sell. So the food of the sturdy foresters during the summer and autumn of 1787 was mainly the fish of the streams and the game of the woods, but these were of the best. The streams were full of trout, some of them weighing 5 pounds. And the woods with wild game such as moose, bears in abundance, deer, partridges, etc. And these, with a few condiments brought in by the party, vegetables and corn of the summer's growth, and a little flour from the older settlements, furnished bills of fare tempting even to gourmands. And where and were amply sufficient for pioneers of the settlement. So I want you to picture 1787 Montpelier. Most of it's forest, heavily forested. There are a few clearings around the river itself, around the Winooski River, which, by the way, has its name from a wild edible food. The ramps, wild leeks. And it does say that some of the trout weigh 5 pounds. And if anybody's a fisherman or fisher person, you would kind of drop your jaw at that right now, because if you think about fishing for trout in Montpelier itself, in and around Montpelier, that far up the Winooski, there are no 5-pound trout there nowadays. So like a 5-pound brook trout, which is the only native trout at that time, unless they're counting salmon, which may or may not have reached that far up the Winooski. 5-pound brook trout would just be a massive trout, approaching 2 feet in length. It would be incredible. So food is history. I'm going to take a moment to highlight this old homestead. This is in, I think this was taken in 1950 in Berlin, Vermont, right up the road from Berlin Pond, going up the Irish Hill Trail, which is known as the Darling Road, or was known as the Darling Road. And this is the Stewart Farm, and it's founded by Simpson Stewart in the late 1700s. You can see the house there. There's a barn back in the distance. And if you look between the two the sewing wheels there, the spinning wheels, you can see that little baby spruce tree there. And if you go and visit that site now, that spruce tree is probably 40 to 50 feet tall at least, which is pretty interesting. But I bring this place up because I've really done a lot of research into the history of the location, and I've also done a lot of wild harvesting there. And there, right now, if you go there now, it's just this overgrown field. There's some trees, there's some old apple trees, there's a cellar hole, and there's the foundation of the barn that's back in the distance there. And there's the giant spruce tree, which is just the baby in that picture. The picture I just put up is of an apple that I harvested just this past fall at that location. So those apple trees that the Stewart family planted there, some of them are still in production. There's still some trees that were alive from the 1950s when the Stewart family still lived there. And you can still go out and harvest those apples, and some of them are delicious. This is a beautiful apple. I can't remember the variety off the top of my head. I did some research into it, but it's a known variety. But there are also some apples that sprouted up as well. Also, this photo was also taken at that homestead, and just this past fall. And these are hops. And doing a little research into it, we found out that the Stewart family was a major producer of hops. They grew thousands of pounds of hops every year. But the food, the hops and the apples, there are also tons of ostrich fern, fiddlehead ferns, and the largest of them, the oldest of them, the crowns, are right around the cellar hole where the house used to be. So I imagine that the family transplanted them there for ease of harvest. But they're just massive, some of the biggest fiddleheads I've ever seen. The stalks are so thick. But all the food around there tells us the history of the place and what that family ate, which I think is incredibly interesting. You can actually go there and taste the apples that the Simpson family were eating themselves. All right. So food is also weather and biology in addition to history. And in this photo, you see a very sad looking pine branch. This is a white pine. And you can actually make tea from white pine. And it's a great tea, super high in vitamin C, good for you, tastes great. But you can taste the difference depending on the weather. This photo was taken when I think it was negative 20 degrees. It was really harsh. A couple winters ago, we had a really harsh streak, couple weeks, really cold. And you can see the needles have become a little desiccated. The tree's kind of struggling a little bit, so it's pulling all of its moisture to the trunk to help protect itself. It's kind of shunting away from the needles. And I made a tea from these needles, and it tasted terrible. And normally I'm a really big fan of pine needle tea. I make it all the time. But you could taste the difference based on the weather. And from that same tree, in the spring, I harvested another handful of pine needles, and it was a completely different flavor of tea. And I prepared it the exact same way. So food is phonology, and phonology is the study of change, cyclical changes over time in relation, usually in relation to plants and animals. So for instance, we have a spruce tree here in this photo, and you can see the tips that are just starting to grow. And at this stage, and actually slightly a little bit before this, maybe a couple days before this stage, if you were to harvest those tips and you could just pop them right in your mouth, they would taste amazingly similar to Skittles. And they just have this really bright citrusy flavor that just really bursts in your mouth. And then, just 1 week later, in this photo, you can see the spruce tips have elongated quite a bit, and they lose the potency in their flavor. They're still very good, still very tender. You can still make teas and cook with them at this stage, but it's not going to have the same exact flavor. It's going to have a different flavor profile. So within one plant, this is the same tree, by the way, just a week apart. In one plant, 1 week you can have one flavor, the next week you can have a completely different flavor. And you're really not going to know this unless you are tuning into it. And that's why I bring this stuff up. So all of this, all of these foods that I'm bringing up are just different ways for you and your family or your students to tune into the rhythms of nature. It's a new way to observe and partake in nature. And I've been doing this for years now, harvesting. I try to do at least one wild harvested ingredient a week. And you really become in tune with those cyclical rhythms of nature. You get in tune with the weather and how that's going to affect every little thing, every plant out there, and how it's going to taste it. And you really tune into different locations as well, different places, and when to harvest at that location. Because one location, 1 week, the spruce tips are going to be prime. They're going to be in that Skittle flavor zone, which is my favorite. And then another location, the very same day, they might not even be open yet. The buds might still be tight and compact. So it really, really varies from place to place. Also, food tastes good. And this is a photo of some chilled fiddlehead salad with maple candied walnuts, and I think that is gorgonzola cheese. It's got some violet petals in there to brighten it up a little bit. Any questions thus far? Netflix.
Oh.
All right, I'll go on. So I'm going to dive a little bit into safety and protocols and dealing with wild foods. And I really want to emphasize that don't do this with kids, or don't do it on your own until you've done your research. All right? You have to have a very solid baseline of plant identification for one. don't just go out and learn the edible plants. Learn all of the plants. All right. One, it'll help your identification skills more quickly, build quicker if you're learning everything as you go. Also, you're going to learn more about plants that might look like the edible plants. Right? There's lots of great books out there. With books, but really nothing's going to replace going out in the field with an expert. And you have to do that multiple times over a course of time before it's really going to sink in. All right. Don't eat edible plants. Don't eat any plants unless you know what you're percent confident and you've gone through all the steps. All right. And even then, if you're unsure, leave it alone. All right. And consult others all the time. And then, and only then, once you really become comfortable, then you can start doing it with kids. You can start incorporating it into your curriculum and with your students. All right. So here's a few books. This is, there's two authors that I'm going to mention, and they're just fantastic. The first one is Samuel Thayer. He's based in the Midwest, but his books cover a lot of the same species that we're going to have here in New England. Any book by him is great. This one's The Forager's Harvest. Each book breaks down, has a really multi-page, in-depth outline for, like, I think he covers 20 to 30 species in each book. So he's not trying to encompass everything in one book, but what he does cover in a book, he goes really in depth, which I think is a preferred way to do it. So Forager's Harvest is one. I believe that was his first one. He also has Nature's Garden, which does the same exact thing as Forager's Harvest, just different plants. And his third one is Incredible Wild Edibles. All right. There's another author. Oops, wrong way. Pascale Badar. I believe that's how you pronounce his last name. And he's one of my heroes right now. His book, The New Wildcrafted Cuisine, it's not so much an identification guide as it is a way to think of these ingredients. So go to Sam Thayer first. He's going to help you with your identification and toxic lookalikes. If he's going to cover if there's any parts of the plants that are toxic versus parts of that same plant that are edible. You're going to go into proper preparation and everything as well as sustainable harvest. Pascale, he's going to go into actually using these ingredients more in depth. All right, so The New Wildcrafted Cuisine is a good intro book into thinking of these new ingredients. The Wildcrafting Brewer was a second book, came out last year, the year before, and it goes into brewing, and that's not just beers or he calls them boozy concoctions, but also fermented sodas as well. They're a great resource. And his new one, which I actually don't own yet, but I need to purchase it. I'm sure it's fantastic, just like his other two, is Wildcrafted Fermentation. So he makes wildcrafted kimchi. He makes different nut cheeses as well, fermented nut cheeses. I'm really looking forward to getting this book. This is going to be fantastic. All right. There's tons of other guides out there as well. Read as much as you can, as often as you can. All right. We have a protocol at the North Branch Nature Center that we use when harvesting with children. And if you're interested, we do have a PDF that I can give out. Just email me afterwards. I can send that along as an attachment. But I'll run down it really quickly right now. And if you want it, again, just a hard copy of it, email me afterwards. I can get it to you. But if you're not familiar with the plant, assume it's poisonous for eating reasons. All right. You don't want it. If you don't know what it is, don't put it in your mouth. Definitely don't put it in the mouth of children. All right. 100% positively identify the plant you'd like to harvest. Know what it is. Know if there are any poisonous lookalikes, and don't harvest plants with kids that do have poisonous lookalikes. All right. One, you could be getting it wrong. Two, anything you teach these kids, as far as wild harvesting, there is a chance that they are going to go out and do it on their own without supervision. No matter how much you drill it into their heads, don't harvest this without your parents or an adult that knows what they're doing. All right. So as an extra safeguard, I don't teach kids anything that has a poisonous lookalike. We just stay away from it. All right. Know if there's any parts of the plant that you can't eat, because there are plants that have some parts that are poisonous. Avoid harvesting, or consider where you're harvesting, all right? Don't harvest right next to roadsides. There's going to be a lot of heavy metals and other nasty stuff coming off the road. It's going to contaminate the food. Keep in mind the season and the parts of the plant that you're harvesting. Know if you're going to be harming that plant by taking, or harming the population of that plant if you're taking certain parts of it, all right? Or taking too much of it. And know which plants are threatened or endangered as well. That's a responsibility that you have to take on yourself. All right. So you have to identify it yourself. Confirm the ID with the field guide. Let students see that field guide, but don't tell them outright what the plant is right away. Okay? So this is the point where I'm going to ask you to unmute yourselves, because we're going to do a little exercise. I know a lot of people are going to know what this is right off the bat. Don't say it. What we're going to do, we're going to go around and we can just popcorn out observations you have of this plant. All right? It could be color, it could be, we can't feel it right now because we're just looking at the picture, but you can kind of see texture, all those things. Just go ahead and shout it out.
Green.
Green. Perfect. What part of it's green?
The stem.
Excellent. What else?
Papery.
Furry. What part is furry?
Papery. Like
Papery.
like paper, like that brown stuff around where it's round. Yeah.
Right there.
Yep.
There's an indent in the stem.
Excellent. Yep. That's crucial for this one right here.
Mm-hmm.
What else do we notice?
The stem is really smooth.
Yes. It's smooth. Doesn't look like it has any hair on it. All right.
Multiple fronds are coming up out of one plant.
Yeah. You can kind of see down at the base here. Can everybody see my cursor there?
Yeah.
That it's coming out of a little mound there, and the technical name for that is called a corm, I believe. But they're all coming out of one mound. This is the same plant over here. Usually with students, I'm really mean, and I make them go around a circle at least twice, not repeating themselves, before telling them what it is. So we can see this is actually the fertile frond. Oops, look at that. This is a fertile frond here. It's all brown, and you can see it's kind of got this fuzzy, furry texture to it here. And those are the spores getting ready to release from that fertile frond. So it's brown, it's tall, kind of looks like a feather, right?
Yeah.
All right, who wants to shout out what this is? Anybody? It's okay if you're not correct.
It's go ahead, Max. What is
Ostrich fern.
Ostrich fern, yeah.
Good.
It's a fern. Fiddlehead fern, ostrich fern. Got it. Excellent. And this is the fiddlehead that is safe to eat. All right. The key identification features, guess what? You already said them. It's green. It's got that indentation, almost like a celery stalk on the stem there. It's got a papery husk. It's smooth. It doesn't have fur on the stem. All right. All of those things rule out the other ferns that we have growing in this area that could be toxic. All right. Excellent job. You guys are better than you thought you were. All right. So after you've gone around, identified all those characteristics, really beat it into the ground with kids, then you can talk about other things. Identify it. Have the kids identify it if you can. Have them look into the field guide, get them used to using the field guides. Talk about which parts are safe to harvest, if there's poisonous lookalikes, and talk about how to safely harvest it for the plant themselves, the population itself. I like to, with kids, talk about the rule of 10. For every 10 plants you see, you can harvest one. A lot of foragers will go by thirds or fourths. I like teaching the rule of 10 because, particularly with kids, because there's a lot of these plants like the ostrich fern that have a tendency to be over harvested for commercial purposes or just overzealous folks harvesting them. I wish I looked and looked and looked to find a photo of ostrich fern clumps where every frond coming up is just clipped off. I know I have a photo somewhere, I couldn't find it. That's really unfortunate because those plants, they store up that energy all winter long that they collected all through the summer. They store that energy to push forth those new fronds in the spring. And it's just a shame if somebody comes along and cuts those off because it's all that energy is going to waste and it weakens the plant overall. So they have less energy going into the winter. So for fiddleheads in particular, I like taking maybe one or two fiddleheads per corm, per mound. And then overall, only taking maybe 10% of what's actually there. That way you're leaving enough for the plants themselves. You're leaving enough for other foragers potentially, and you're leaving enough for other creatures out there that need those things to survive, right? There's a lot of things that, everything that we're harvesting is a cog in the wheel of that environment, that particular place. And if we're taking those cogs out, we're gonna throw that system into chaos. So we wanna leave as much there as possible so that everything can continue to function as needed. You only take what you need. You don't need that much. All right, so after you've harvested the plant, if it's edible raw, I like to give students a little nibble and just to get a taste profile of that so that, and then I have them share out what it tastes like. And you may actually hear this little guy in the background right now. He's getting put to bed and he sounds unhappy about it. But this is my son, and he is eating a little bit of red clover. We had gone through that process with him, and this is in our backyard there, in front of our giant elderberry bush. I think we had 50 pounds of berries off that one bush this past year. All right, any questions about safety and identification? Feel free to shout them out. If not, I'm gonna move into some recipes and food and wild plants that you can actually start off with.
Hey, Ken.
Yeah, Amy.
There's a question from Sarah and Max about wondering if they could eat all spruce buds, like all species that are native.
Yeah, any spruce that you're gonna find is safe to eat, so long as you're considering the location as well. Don't harvest next to the roadside. Not a good idea. It's gonna get all that nasty junk from the cars in the road. But all spruce are safe. There is one evergreen that is toxic, and that is yew, Y-E-W. And you're gonna find that more in suburban, urban areas. It's a common ornamental plant. And it's gonna have needles that look similar to balsam fir, but it's gonna be more shrubby. Usually they're kind of well manicured and they're trimmed and everything, but not always. But spruce needles, I actually have some spruce needles actually here, but spruce needles are going to be pointy, they're going to be spiky. I call them spiky spruce. If you pick one needle off and you can roll it in between your fingers, it should roll pretty easily because the needle itself is round. All right. Other needles are going to be flat. Like hemlock needles are flat, fir needles are flat, and the yew needles are going to be flat as well. So if you're really concerned about whether or not you're harvesting yew, do that needle test, pick it off the branch, and try rolling it in between your fingers. And if it rolls in between your fingers, it's safe, right?
Great. And there's one more question about, well, not a question, but more of a comment about fiddleheads can, maybe certain kinds of what we call fiddleheads can make people sick or aren't the best for eating. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. So ostrich fern is the safest of the fiddleheads. All ferns, when they're first coming up, go through a fiddlehead stage where the frond is just starting to unfurl. But ostrich fern is the safest. It could still cause some gastric upset. There's ways of preparing it. You do have to cook it. Don't eat it raw, otherwise you will get a stomach ache, or you're more likely to get a stomach ache. And I steam it usually for 12 minutes. For that salad, I steam it for about 12 minutes, and then I throw it directly into an ice water bath to chill it down. That way it doesn't get mushy. If you cook ostrich fern the length of time that they recommend, it does tend to get mushy. So I like preparing it that way, where I throw it right into the ice water bath afterwards. That's going to hold its crispness and still give that vibrant green color as well. There are other fern species that people have eaten and do eat. I know, I know bracken fern is one. But there have been a lot of studies, I think particularly out of Ireland, I want to say, where it's been shown to increase your likelihood of getting stomach cancer, which is not a good thing. So I stay away from bracken fern. Though some folks do eat it and they say it's fine, but I'm not going to eat it. So I'd recommend sticking with ostrich fern. Also, you want to think about where you're harvesting it from. And again, think about the weather. Think about all those environmental factors that are playing in. If you had a spring flood recently, that could have that could have covered the fiddleheads or the corms before they've unfurled. It could have contaminated those particular fiddleheads. So you could be getting other contaminants on your fiddleheads that you're harvesting. So be mindful of that. Yeah. Any other questions? Those are good questions.
I have one more quick question. Where was this photo taken?
This was in my yard in Barry.
Whoa, that's crazy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's about half of that elderberry bush. If you're interested in black elderberries, go to Perfect Circle Farm, put in the plug for Buzz Ferber. He gifted to us as a housewarming gift, and it's prolific. So, yeah. All right. Let's get into some actual things that you can make. And this is a fun one that I like to do. I've done with campers a lot, called hiking soda. You can actually taste your hike. And what we do, we take a flip top bottle, we go out on a hike, the bottle's empty when we start off, and as we're going along, we'll identify some plants that we know are edible. Usually they're plants that we've already identified earlier in the week, and then we just take a few, drop them in the bottle. All right, we can close the top, hike along, find some more, put them in there. So this particular one, it looks like we have some white pine needles. We have some red raspberry. I think there's a few black cap raspberries in there. And I believe there's some aronia berry floating around in there as well. All right, so you take your ingredients, plug them in the bottle, close the cap. When you get back from your hike, you can fill it with water and then add however much sugar you want and then shake it up really well. And that's a great activity for the kids to do. Just pass it around your circle. It's a good closing circle activity. At the end of the day, normally during our closing circles, we have something called a talking stick. When the stick comes to you, you can share your favorite part of the day. When days where we do hiking sodas, I like passing the bottle around. And when the talking bottle comes to you, as you're sharing your favorite part of the day, you can be taking your turn shaking that up, shaking those sugars up and dissolving them into the water, right? And that's also crushing the berries a little bit, giving a little bit of that color that you see in the bottom of the bottle there. And you can use whatever kind of sugar you want. You can use straight up white sugar, you can use brown sugar, you can use maple syrup, you can use maple sugar, you can use honey, whatever you want, whatever floats your boat, right? Okay. Then to turn it from what's essentially a tea, a decoction, into a soda is one of two things. You could ferment it by pitching in some yeast or using the natural yeast found on the ingredients themselves, because there's yeast everywhere in our environment, and all that yeast is going to have its own flavor profile. I haven't delved into wild yeast harvest yet on my long list of things to do. Or you can take just regular baking yeast, works fine. I don't like adding a ton of baking yeast, bread yeast, because you do get that kind of bready, yeasty flavor out of it. I prefer using champagne yeast, and you can just order that online or at any brewery store where you can buy airlocks or anything like that, brewery supply store, and they should have champagne yeast, or you can get it online, like I said. Champagne yeast acts really fast and gets really bubbly, which is why I prefer it. So you pitch that in there, and it starts working its magic on feeding on the sugars in there, and it's actually burping out or farting out the bubbles, the carbonation in there, right? So that's where you're going to get your fizziness. Now, when doing fermented sodas with kids, you want to make sure you're not letting it go too far, because then you start getting into boozy territory, and that's not a great thing to do with kids. All right. So I like letting it go usually about 24 hours, let the yeast work for 24 hours, and then stick it into a refrigerator to chill it. And that's going to stop, or at least slow down, the fermentation process enough. And that's going to stop it before the stage where you're going to start getting an alcohol content in there. Now, the second way you can do it, which is way easier, is let it sit overnight and let those ingredients infuse into the water, so you're getting that infusion. And then the next day when you're with kids, you have the tea, and then you just take some seltzer and mix it in, and you have instant soda. So that's hiking soda. And I did get that idea out of, I don't think it was the new Wildcraft Cuisine. I think it was his fermentation book. Or not fermentation book, the brewing book that Pascale has. Again, those are great books. Definitely recommend supporting him and buying those. So hiking soda, good stuff. And yet this is going to taste different every single time depending on where you are and what ingredients you have available to you. So you are literally tasting the place that you just walked over. Another popular one is I call Porcupine Bread. It's you take spruce needles and you dehydrate them and you grind them up with regular sugar. You use whatever kind of sugar you want. Again, it does have to be in crystal form, in granular form. I haven't messed around with trying to grind it up in a liquid form of sugar yet. It might be done. I just haven't experimented with it yet. I like using 1 part dehydrated needles to 2 parts sugar. And you can either grind that up in a mortar and pestle. If you get a big fat mortar and pestle, kids love grinding that up. It's a good, busy handwork thing for them to do. You could also, this is quicker and easier, just put it in a coffee grinder and kind of just pulse it until those needles are finely ground. I like leaving a little bit of chunk in there. You can see on this picture, there's little specks right there, those green specks. Those are all needles that weren't quite ground into a powder. All right, and this is based off of a bannock bread recipe, which is just a simple bread that's usually cooked on a skillet. In this case, the skillet is a piece of slate, adding a little bit more to the terroir of this meal. And it comes out fantastic pretty much every time. I haven't had a bad batch yet. Delicious stuff. Kids love making it. It does turn out slightly green, which is fun. Another thing you can do if you're getting a little more fancy, well, you can use that spruce sugar and replace it for any baking recipe that you want and just experiment. So, for instance, I've made spruce needle scones before, and it's probably my favorite way to do it. Use spruce needles so far. You just take your favorite scone recipe and instead of regular sugar that you're putting in there, just put in your spruce sugar. I have a friend, she made some spruce needle puffs that were delicious. So the icy filling that she pumped in there was made with spruce sugar. There's lots of stuff that you can do with it. You could also grind it up with just regular flour and have spruce flour if you're looking for something more savory. All right. This is one of my favorite things to do. Super simple. It's making birch beer. I mentioned black birch or sweet birch before. We don't have that around here, but we do have yellow birch, which is what is in this bottle. So you're looking for yellow birch. You find some twigs. I usually don't go thicker than like pinky thickness. But you want to fill up a mason jar close to full, at least like 3/4 of the way full. And you're going to clip those twigs up into about 1-inch lengths or so. All right. And my son is going through a phase right now where he's really loving using the hand pruning shears. And he helped me clip a batch of birch beer just the other day, and we have it sitting on the counter downstairs. But once you get your yellow birch cut up in 1-inch sections, and you put them in your mason jar, I think this is a 1/2 gallon mason jar here. You want to put some water in a kettle, let it boil or come close to boiling, and you're going to fill the mason jar up with that hot water about halfway, and then the rest of the way you're going to fill it up with warm water from the tap. And the reason you want to do that is if you go straight boiling water, you're going to start leaching out too many of the tannic acids that are in the birch bark. And you're going to end up with a bitter birch beer. And not the good kind of bitter, not the hoppy bitter. So go half and half. Hot water, half hot water and half warm water, kind of temper that and bring that heat down a little bit. All right. Strikes a good balance. Let that sit overnight. For a half gallon, like in this photo here, I like adding at least a half to 3/4 cup of brown sugar. And you shake that up. Another good activity for kids. Just shake that up until it's all well incorporated, all right? Shake it until when you set it down and it all settles, there you shouldn't see any grains of sugar left. It should all be well incorporated into the liquid itself. And then, once it's cooled down, you can pitch your yeast, all right? So just like the soda that I talked about for the hiking soda. You can take champagne yeast, you can take regular bread yeast. I got a batch going right now that's just using regular bread yeast. And so long as you don't use too much of it, maybe like just a pinch, you're gonna be all right. You're not gonna get that yeasty bread flavor. Again, just like the soda, let it go for 24 hours or so. Sometimes you have to let it go just a little bit more to get that extra carbonation in there. That's okay. I definitely don't go past 36 hours. Otherwise, you're going to get boozy, too boozy. Then I like straining it out through cheesecloth to get all the little particles from the nasty bits from the bark itself out. And then pour it through a funnel into a flip-top bottle and put it in your fridge. All right. And that carbonation is going to build up in there. So when you pop that flip-top, it's just going to go. And you're going to hear that awesome fizzy carbonation coming out of there. A couple of years ago, I did a winter wild edibles course where we made a big batch of birch beer, and everybody just downed it. And one woman just sat in the chair holding the jar in her lap and just sniffing it. And she was just in utter bliss. It smells so good. It has a similar flavor to root beer, which I think is why I like it so much. I'm a huge fan of root beer. But it's good stuff. It does have its own little flavor profile. And this is something that you can do this time of year. This time of year is perfect because the saps are just starting to flow through that birch, and it's going to have this peak flavor right now. But you can do it in the winter as well. You're still going to get a good product. Coming up, we got ramp season. All right. Ramps are one that I don't do with kids a whole lot, but I've done it in the past a little bit. And usually, when I do it with kids, I just make a quick saute and we eat them right there on the trail. But ramps are one, just like the fiddleheads, they tend to be over harvested, and people really guard their ramp patches viciously, and rightfully so. It's a big problem down south with ramp over harvesting, where they just have literally truck bed fulls of ramps that people will drive in with to markets. But there's an easy way to get your ramp flavor without over harvesting. And if you look at this picture on the left, you can see ramps usually have 2 stems coming up. Sometimes they will have 3, just to throw you for a loop. And sometimes the stalk at the base will be red, but most of the time I've found around here at least that it tends to be white at the base. There is some variation. But what you can do is just harvest 1 leaf from each plant, and it's going to have a ton of oniony, garlicky flavor to it, and you don't have to dig up the bulb, right? If I'm looking to just chop up some ramps and to saute them with a meal, I just use the leaves themselves. They're going to have the most potent flavor, I think, at least. I only really use the bulbs for if I'm like making pickled ramps and pickling the bulbs. But one thing I like to do with ramps is it actually extends the harvest a little bit longer, is to make ramp butter. And it's really easy. All you have to do is chop up the ramps really fine. Some people recommend dehydrating them first and then mixing them into your softened butter. I've done it both ways, and I think both ways work. Dehydrating the ramp leaves first or not dehydrating the ramp leaves. But you can take this and then freeze it for up to 2 to 3 months, and it's fine. And you can just take it out in the middle of summer. You can take a steak off the grill and slather some ramp butter over top of it. It is just heaven. It's amazing. Another thing you can do with this ramp butter is make biscuits with it. So your favorite biscuit recipe, substitute ramp butter in for regular butter, and you're gonna have amazing garlicky, oniony biscuits. Really good stuff. Any questions about any of the recipe ideas thus far? Feel free to turn off your mute and shout them out.
Ken, there is a question from Noah about a root beer tree.
Yes.
And can you make root beer from it?
So I often refer to yellow birch as the root beer tree because it does taste like root beer. So that might be where he's getting it from.
That sounds right. He just have to brush his teeth, but yeah, that sounds right.
Yep. There are some plants around here that have traditionally been used to make actual root beer. So sarsaparilla is one. I haven't found a patch of it yet where I feel comfortable harvesting enough to make sarsaparilla out of it. But I'm on the lookout for it. I haven't tried it yet.
Okay. Ken, I just want to let you know it's 8 o'clock.
Yes. This is my last slide right here.
Oh.
So the last thing I want to cover, and it's a really good beginning of the school year thing to cover with kids, with students, is sumac aid. Late August, early September is the time to harvest sumac. And this photo here, it's in peak flavor right now. When it gets that deep, dark purple flavor, you can see the individual berries here on the clusters. They have those little hairs. You want to take, before you pick it, you want to take one of those individual berries and place it right on the tip of your tongue. And if you get that really powerful punch of tartness socking you right on the tongue, then you know it's ready. If it's just kind of dull, let it go another week or so, right? But once it's really socking it to you with that sourness and tartness, that's when it's ready to harvest. And my favorite thing to do with sumac is make sumac aid, which is in this picture here. My son and I made this a couple years ago, this batch, and I experimented with a different way of doing it. Most of the time I've done like a warm water infusion where I put it in a mason jar. I like stripping all the little individual berries off, which is a pain to do, but you can kind of see in the cracks here, there's some little bit of crud in there. That's probably frass, which is insect poop. There's a type of bug that lives in, I think they just live in sumac. They specialize in that. This is a whole environment in and of itself. There's all sorts of critters living and crawling around inside there and pooping out their poop. And you don't want that in your drink. At least I don't. So I like picking the berries off first. So I put them in a jar, and then I actually took an immersion blender and just pulsed it real quick, just a couple times. And what it did was knock all those hairs off of each individual seed. And I let it settle, and all the seeds sank to the bottom. And I just poured off and strained out the liquid. And this is what we were left with. And gives it really beautiful color. And do recommend adding sugar to it because it's super tart, unless you like super tart things, which I do. I've drank it a few times without sugar. But add as much sugar as you like, sugar to taste, and you have Sumac-ade. All right, I'm gonna stop presenting at this point. All right, any other questions?
Ken, I have a question about the homestead that you showed in the beginning. This is Rachel, by the way.
Yes. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, and thanks. You're awesome. This has been great. Where is that? You said, sorry, I joined right when you were talking about that. You said
yeah.
it's Berlin Pond.
Yeah, are you familiar with the Irish Hill Trailhead?
No.
So there's the main, so as you're coming down in the Berlin Pond, they have the new canoe kayak launch site there on the left.
Uh-huh.
If you continue driving past that and go up the hill and hang a left, you go past a house or two, there's going to be a little parking lot up the hill and on the right. You can see it from that dirt road, and that's the Irish Hill Trailhead. And if you hike back that main road, there's a bunch of mountain biking trails there as well. But if you hike along the main road itself, you'll eventually come to a big clearing on the right, and that's where the homestead is.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. It's an awesome place to check out. We did, Sean Beckett and I this fall did a wild apple workshop at that homestead where we harvested apples from the farm there, and we made apple cider right there. And we actually took the hops, and I took some previously and dried them out from that location, and we threw the hops into our hot cider. So we dry hopped our cider, and it was amazing, so good. All right. Any other questions? Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody.
What time is supper, Ken?
I already ate supper tonight.
Oh, when are you cooking supper for all of us?
Oh, we'll have to wait and see after this quarantine.
The wild leek butter got me. My stomach started to be like, I'm
No
hungry.
doubt.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, Ken.
Thank you.
It's really helpful as snow is falling at my house today to be reminded of all the greenery that's coming soon. And I think Ken, are you going to have another one for us as things green up?
Yeah.
All right. So we can look forward to that maybe in May or later in April.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody. And if you haven't checked out our online platform on our website, which is probably how you got in here tonight, please do that. And next week on Thursday at the same time, I'm going to be presenting about routines and rhythms that you can be practicing at home with your family to be connected to the outside world. And that is what I'm going to be talking about is totally reflective of the work that we do in public schools and in Forest Preschool. So that's April, I believe that's April, I'm looking at my calendar right here. That's April 9th. And then on the 16th, we're going to have songs. That's the next Thursday webinar for parents and teachers. On April 16th, it's going to be songs, rhymes, and finger plays. And I'm actually putting together a panel of teachers and educators. Looks like maybe an international presenter too, to come in and just share some songs, rhymes, and finger plays with us for young children. And that's one that will be open for families. So you can, that will happen a little bit earlier. That one's going to happen at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on April 16th. So you can bring your little ones and have them come sit with you. So thanks so much, everyone. Thank you, Ken, so much. That was great.